Hey guys, tonight we begin with the final days of Rome in Britannia, a land where mighty stone walls took decades to build, yet were abandoned after just a single winter. Once this was the pinnacle of civilization, grand public bathhouses where dozens of strangers would soak in the same pool all day. Today, such a thing would earn an immediate shutdown from a health inspector, but for them it was the height of refinement. You might find yourself walking along Hadrian's Wall in the morning fog, or wandering into an abandoned market street where the wind howls through shattered windows, but rest assured you are not alone. I'm here to tell the story, and you only need to listen. If you enjoy stories like this, please click like and subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. Now, tell me, where are you right now, and what time is it? It's fascinating to see people from all over the world sharing this same moment together. So now, turn off the lights. Huge. Let a gentle breeze fill the room. Put on your headphones. In the next few seconds, the screen will slowly fade to black. Not a glitch, but a way to help your eyes move away from the blue light, so your body can begin producing melatonin, the hormone that helps you sleep and relax. A touch of darkness will tell your brain, it's time to rest. And now, let's begin. Imagine a man, his name lost to the damp earth and swirling mists of time. It is the 8th century, perhaps the 9th, and he is climbing through the skeleton of a city. He is a poet, and all around him lie the ghosts of a fallen world. The air is thick with the smell of wet stone and decay, a silence so profound it seems to swallow sound. He sees not just rubble, but a story, a warning. Lifting a hand, he traces the line of a collapsed archway, his fingers brushing against masonry so masterful, so impossibly grand, that it could only be the work of giants. And yet, it is shattered. The roofs have tumbled, the towers are broken husks against a grey sky, and the plaster once gleaming has bled away like a forgotten memory. This place, he thinks, was a wonder, this wallstone wondrous. And now, it is undone. Fate has smashed it. This poem, which we call simply The Ruin, is our first haunting glimpse into the long shadow of Roman Britain, a world that rose like a marble mirage, only to dissolve back into the land it had tried to tame. The ruin the poet likely walked was the Roman city of Bath, and like the city itself, the poem is a fragment, its edges burned away by some ancient fire, its words breaking off just as the story reaches its most vital moments. It is a perfect, tragic mirror of the civilization it mourns. And to understand its fall, we must first travel back to its violent, improbable birth, back to a time when Britain was not a province, but a whispered legend at the very edge of the known world. For Rome in the 1st century before Christ, the world had an edge. It was a frontier drawn, not by maps, but by fear. And beyond that frontier, across a treacherous strip of spitting grey water, lay an island shrouded in dread and fantasy, Britannia. To the ordered, sun-drenched mind of a Roman citizen, it was a place of bog witches and painted demons. A phantom island that, according to the historian Plutarch, some argued had never even existed at all its name. A fabrication to frighten children. The crossing itself was a trial, only 30 kilometres at its narrowest point, yet this was no placid sea. This was a battleground of weather, where the harsh systems of the North Atlantic converged in a fury of howling gales and currents that could drag a ship to its doom. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote of its nature with a shiver, describing a sea that swells with dreadful surges, only to then sink again as flat as a level plain, a deception that had already swallowed the ambitions of generals and emperors. It was a monstrous living barrier, guarding the island's secrets with a jealous rage. This watery abyss had defeated even the great Julius Caesar. He tried twice in 55 and 54 BC, and both times the island fought him back, not with armies alone, but with its very substance. His campaigns sank into the marshy, grasping lands of Kent, his legions battered by storms, his treasure and his men's lives devoured by the land itself. Caesar, who would bend the entire Roman Republic to his will, returned not with victory, but with tales of horror that only deepened the island's mystique. He wrote of its inhabitants with a kind of clinical revulsion, describing a people who did not sow grain, but lived on milk and flesh clad in animal skins. All the Britons, he wrote, dye themselves with woad, which gives them a bluish colour and a terrifying appearance in battle. He described warriors with long, wild hair, their bodies shaved, but for the head and upper lip. Spirits of the mist and fen, their eyes holding the wildness of an untamed world. It was a portrait designed to both fascinate and repel the Roman public, solidifying Britain's reputation as a place outside the laws of gods and men. This reputation as an unobtainable prize, a cursed land, would endure for generations. The Emperor Augustus Caesar's own successor planned no fewer than 3 separate invasions, and each one dissolved into rumour and logistical failure before a single ship set sail. And then came the most bizarre chapter in this long saga of failure. The notorious Emperor Caligula. Poised on the coast of Gaul, he amassed a colossal force of 200,000 men, an army that could have surely overwhelmed the island. The legionaries could taste the conquest. They could see the chalk cliffs of their prize gleaming across the water. But Caligula, whose grasp on reality was as treacherous as the Channel itself, was not a man driven by strategy. He was driven by whim. On the very eve of invasion, he gave an order so strange, so utterly mad it has echoed through history as a monument to absolute power's absurdity. The order was given. The invasion was off. Instead, they would gather seashells. His soldiers, the finest fighting force in the world, were commanded to wade into the surf and fill their helmets with the ocean's trinkets, a triumph over Neptune himself. Britain once again was spared, protected not by its warriors, but by the lunacy of its would-be conqueror. For nearly a century after Caesar's first attempt, the island remained a stubborn stain on the imperial map, a constant nagging reminder of the limits of Roman power. It was a land of myth, an obsession, a prize that seemed to poison the minds of all who sought it. But the gears of empire are relentless, and soon another emperor, a man eager to cement his own fragile legacy, would cast his eyes north. His name was Claudius, and he would not be denied. He would not be stopped by storms or legends or madmen. He was coming to extinguish the myth of Britannia and replace it with the brutal, glittering reality of Rome. The Emperor Claudius was not a man born for conquest. History remembers him as an afterthought, a scholar with a stammer and a limp hidden away while his more glamorous and often more psychopathic relatives played at power. He was the family fool, the one whose physical infirmities made him an object of private ridicule and public scorn. He had survived the deadly court intrigues of Tiberius and Caligula, not through strength, but by being consistently and wisely underestimated. When the Praetorian Guard murdered his monstrous nephew and found Claudius cowering behind a curtain, they made him emperor as a grim, spontaneous joke. But Claudius knew the throne was a precarious seat, and a ruler without a military victory was a ruler waiting for a dagger. He needed a triumph, a spectacle so grand it would silence the whispers, and carve his name into the annals of Rome. And so he looked to the one place that had humiliated Caesar and mocked Caligula. He would not just conquer Britannia, he would tame the nightmare. He would succeed where gods and madmen had failed, and he would do it with a cold, calculated brutality that was far more terrifying than any impulsive whim. This was not a war for territory, it was a war for legitimacy. So it was that in the year 43 AD, the largest amphibious force the world had yet seen gathered on the shores of Gaul. 4 legions, 20,000 professional soldiers, supplemented by an equal number of auxiliaries from across the empire. This was not an army. It was a city of steel and leather, an engine of conquest set to sail. As their ships blotted out the horizon, a knot of dread tightened in the stomachs of the legionaries. They were sailing into a legend, into the maw of the beast that had swallowed their forebears. But Roman discipline was a force stronger than fear. They landed in Kent, the surf churning with mud and blood around their iron-shod sandals, as the Britons, a fierce confederation of tribes under warrior kings, crashed against their shields. The battle that followed was no swift affair. It raged for 2 full days, an eternity in ancient warfare. It was a chaotic, brutal slog, fought in the sucking mud and dense woodlands of the British coast. The Britons fought with a desperate homeland fury, their painted bodies a whirlwind of screaming ferocity, their long swords swinging in wide, devastating arcs against the cold, methodical lines of the legions. The air filled with the alien shriek of their Carnix war horns, the thud of iron on wicker shields, and the guttural cries of men dying in the wet earth, their woad paint mixing with their blood in the grey afternoon light. But fury alone cannot stop a machine. The Britons were broken, forced back in a bloody retreat toward the great estuary of the River Thames. The Romans followed relentless, their discipline unwavering, even as they marched deeper into this alien, hostile land. Here the landscape itself became their enemy, a vast, swampy morass that threatened to swallow their advance. For any other army, it would have been the end. But the Romans were not just soldiers. They were engineers of empire, and they saw nature not as a barrier, but as a problem to be solved. Where there was marsh, they drove thousands of wooden piles into the mud and built solid causeways. Where the river was too wide, they swam their armor a terrible weight or constructed pontoon bridges with a speed and expertise that must have seemed like dark magic to the defenders watching from the opposite bank. Their natural fortresses were being unmade before their very eyes. After another final desperate clash on the river's edge, British resistance in the south was shattered, and only then, when the victory was not just likely, but absolutely assured, did the Emperor Claudius himself deign to arrive. He was not a warrior leading a charge. He was a proprietor, arriving to inspect his new acquisition, his journey, a carefully managed piece of imperial theatre. But he did not come alone. With him, he brought a symbol of power, so alien, so profoundly monstrous, that it was designed not merely to defeat the Britons, but to annihilate their will to fight. He brought an elephant, imagine it, to the people of this damp green island, who knew only horses and hounds, deer and boar. What must this creature have seemed? It lumbered off the ship, a moving mountain of grey, wrinkled hide, its sheer bulk blotting out the sun. The ground itself trembled with the heavy thud of its footfalls. Its trunk, a living serpent, tasted the strange British air with an unnerving intelligence, and its tusks, longer than a man was tall, gleamed like polished bone. Chains rattled against its armoured hide as it let out a trumpeting call that ripped through the sky, a sound from another world, a sound of absolute, incomprehensible power. Even the Roman war horses, trained for the chaos of battle, shied away in terror at its musky alien scent. This was not a beast of their world, or even of their darkest nightmares. This was a god, or a demon, plucked from the burning heart of Rome's impossibly vast empire and set down upon their shore. In that moment, watching this titan of Africa tread upon their ancestral soil, any lingering thought of successful resistance must have evaporated like morning mist. It was the ultimate psychological weapon, a declaration that Rome's reach was limitless, its power supernatural. The island of myth was dead, the province of Britannia was born. With the south cowed by spectacle and steel, the Roman war machine did what it was designed to do, it ground forward. Legions fanned out from the Thames, their eagle standards glinting in the weak British sun, a methodical, unstoppable tide of iron and leather. They pushed into the green heartlands of the island, into the future shires of the Midlands and the rugged hills of Wales, subduing tribes with a ruthless efficiency that was its own form of terror. Resistance was met not with negotiation, but with the short stabbing blade of the gladius and the organised destruction of entire settlements. For a time it seemed nothing could halt the advance, but as they marched ever northward, the land itself began to fight back. The rolling hills steepened into windswept moors, the air grew colder, and the sky seemed to hang lower, heavy, with a perpetual brooding grey. This was Caledonia, the land we now call Scotland, and here the Romans finally met their match. They did not find farmers to subjugate, or chieftains to bribe into compliance. They found something older, something wilder. These were the lands of fierce tribal confederations, warrior clans like the Picts and the Maitai. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing from the comfort of a warm study thousands of miles away, described them with the cold contempt only an urbanite can feel for the true wilderness. These tribes, he wrote, inhabit wild and waterless mountains and desolate and swampy plains. They dwell in tents, naked and unshod. They are very fond of plundering. We do not know what the Picts called themselves, for their language has vanished, leaving behind only the mesmerizing spirals and curls on the beautiful standing stones they erected across their lands. The name Pict was a Roman invention from Picti, meaning the painted ones, a name earned by the brilliant, terrifying war paint they wore into battle. They were phantoms of the mist and bog, and they refused to fight on Roman terms. There would be no glorious set-piece battles here, no neat lines of infantry clashing on an open field. The Picts bled the legions dry, with what we would now call guerrilla warfare. Sudden, brutal raids from the cover of forests, ambushes in narrow mountain passes, and then melting back into a landscape that was their greatest ally. For an army that thrived on order, this was chaos. For soldiers who believed in the manifest destiny of their empire, this was a land that simply refused to be civilized. The Romans knew when to quit. The endless drain on manpower and resources for this wet, inhospitable wilderness was unsustainable. In a rubbish heap at the fort of Vindolanda, a lone preserved writing tablet reveals the deep-seated Roman frustration. Penned in a cursive script, a military intelligence report complains about the local fighters and then uses a word found nowhere else in the vast library of Latin literature, Britunculi. It is not a formal term. It is barracks slang, a bitter dismissive slur that translates loosely and scornfully as nasty little Britons. This is not the language of a confident conqueror. It is the weary, exhausted gripe of an occupying soldier, fed up with the cold, the rain, and an enemy he could neither properly fight nor decisively defeat. This sentiment of grim futility eventually reached the very top. In the year 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian himself came to see this bleeding edge of his empire. He was a builder, a consolidator, and what he saw was not a frontier to be pushed, but a wound to be cauterized. He stood upon a natural ridge of volcanic stone, a jutting cliff that ran the width of the country, and he gave an order that would echo for centuries. He ordered a barrier. It would become the largest single artifact the Roman world would ever produce. A mighty wall snaking for 135 kilometers, from the salt spray of one coast to the churning sea of the other. It was a declaration carved into the very face of the earth, a line of stone and turf, 17 forts, and countless mile castles garrisoned by legions of infantry and cavalry. It was a scar on the landscape, a monumental admission that here Roman ambition had found its limit. They would try, of course, to push further. A generation later they would build another shorter wall, the Antonine 160 kilometers to the north. But it was a fool's errand. Caledonia was unconquerable, and the Antonine wall was soon abandoned, its stones left to sink back into the peaty earth. But Hadrian's barrier stood. To the south lay the province of Britannia, a restless, resentful land held in an iron grip. But to the north lay the mist, the mountains, and the defiant freedom of the Britunculi. The wall was not just a defense, it was a border between two worlds, and the tension across it would define the fate of Roman Britain for the next 300 years. South of the wall, a fragile, resentful peace settled over the land. But this was not a peace of reconciliation. It was the quiet of a conquered people holding their breath. Here Rome waged a different kind of war, a war of culture, stone, and spectacle. For the Romans, the city was not merely a place to live, it was a religion. Urbanism was their gospel, and they were its most zealous missionaries determined to replicate the marble heart of Rome in every new territory they seized. And so out of the damp earth and misty river valleys of Britain, miracles of engineering began to rise. Places that had been little more than muddy collections of thatched roundhouses were transformed almost overnight into glittering hubs of imperial life. Londinium, a small fishing settlement clinging to the marshy banks of the Thames, erupted into a metropolis. Where there had been reeds and mud now stood an ornate forum, a basilica larger than any building the Britons had ever conceived, and enormous public buildings fronted with imported marble and crowned with red-tiled roofs that gleamed in the frequent rain. The air, once smelling of damp earth and wood smoke, now carried the alien scents of spices from the distant East olive oil from Spain and fine wine from the vineyards of Gaul, all moving along the network of dead straight roads that were the arteries of the empire. This new world belonged to a new elite. Roman governors, civil servants, and wealthy statesmen poured into the province, building luxurious villas across the countryside that were islands of Mediterranean comfort in the British wilderness. These were not mere houses. They were palaces resplendent with intricate mosaic floors depicting scenes from mythology, private bathhouses with steaming water, and the ultimate luxury in this damp, chilly land underfloor, heating a kind of magic that banished the cold from the very stones. An urban Briton could now walk on paved streets, enjoy comforts their ancestors could never have imagined, and trade for goods from the far corners of the known world. In return, the island supplied the empire with precious metals, gold, silver, lead, and perhaps most importantly, tin from the shores of Cornwall, a rare and crucial component for forging bronze. But this glittering veneer of civilization was perilously thin. It was an occupation, not an integration. The grand Roman towns were, in essence, fortified green zones, walled compounds where a foreign administration lived and ruled utterly separate from the people they governed. Tomb inscriptions from York tell the story. Officials from Africa, France, Sardinia, a rotating cast of outsiders who stayed for a few years, and then left, never truly putting down roots. Unlike in other provinces like Gaul, there is no evidence that native Britons ever rose to the highest ranks of society, ever became governors of their own land. And in the countryside, in the small villages of timber and turf, tribal loyalties still burned hotter than any allegiance to a distant, faceless emperor. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. That spark came in the year 60 AD, only 17 years after the conquest, and its name was Boudica. She was the warrior queen of the Iceni tribe, a people who had initially allied with Rome. But when her husband died, the Romans betrayed their treaty, seizing the tribe's lands, flogging Boudica in public, and brutally raping her 2 daughters. It was an act of calculated humiliation, designed to break the spirit of the Iceni. It did the opposite. It ignited a firestorm of vengeance that would nearly tear the province apart. Boudica, her hair a wild torrent of red, her voice cracking with fury, rallied her people and their neighbours, and they fell upon the symbols of Roman oppression with a horrifying savagery. First, they descended on Colchester, a city built for retired legionaries. They burned it to the ground, slaughtering its inhabitants without mercy. Then they marched on Londinium, the new bustling hub of commerce. They put it to the torch, a black, greasy smoke rising to the sky as the proud new buildings collapsed into ash. Archaeologists today can still find it a thick red layer of burned clay and charcoal buried beneath modern London, a silent testament to the city's first fiery death. The fury was not just about land, it was a primal scream against a world that was being erased, a violent rejection of the marble, the mosaics, and the overbearing order of Rome. The rebellion was ultimately inevitably crushed. A vastly outnumbered Roman army met Boudica's massive horde in a final decisive battle, and the cold, unyielding discipline of the legions triumphed over chaotic fury. But the message was clear. Britannia would never be a placid, peaceful province. It was a land held by force, a costly possession whose native heart remained stubbornly, dangerously untamed. The embers of Boudica's rebellion were stamped out, but deep in the earth they continued to glow. Britannia existed in a state of perpetual siege, not just from without, but from within. The painted Picts pressed relentlessly against the northern wall, a constant nagging threat that bled the garrisons through 1,000 small cuts. From the west, the sea raiders of the Scoti tribes, from the island of Hibernia, modern Ireland, harassed the coasts. And to the east, across the stormy waters of the North Sea, a new menace was rising. Seagoing tribes from Germania, fierce warriors known as the Saxons, began to brave the treacherous crossing, their longships appearing like spectres out of the fog. At first, they were pirates preying on the rich traffic of trade ships sailing to and from the continent. But their raids grew bolder, their incursions more frequent, striking at the coastal settlements themselves before vanishing back into the waves. The province was a tin can being squeezed from every side, the pressures mounting with each passing year. And we can see this rising tide of fear written quite literally in the ground. One of the most telling measures archaeologists have for tracking the pulse of peace and war in the ancient world is the humble coin hoard. Imagine yourself a farmer or a merchant in Roman Britain. When times are good, when the legions are strong and the borders secure, you feel safe. You keep your silver denarii or gold auri in a chest in your home, or perhaps deposited with a trusted moneylender in the city. But when the rumours start whispers of a Pictish warband breaching the wall of Saxon sails sighted off the coast, a cold dread begins to creep in. You take your life savings, your daughter's dowries, and you bury them. You wrap the coins in a cloth, place them in a pottery jar, and commit them to the earth in a secret spot, praying you will be able to return and dig them up when the danger has passed. If the unrest is minor, you do. The hoard vanishes from the archaeological record. But if the danger is catastrophic, if the raiders come and you are killed or forced to flee forever, your treasure remains in the ground. A small, personal tragedy, frozen in time, a time capsule of fear. And as the 2nd century drew to a close, people in Roman Britain began burying their coins in record numbers, a silent scream of terror echoing up from the soil. The Great Peace, the Pax Romana that had held for nearly 200 years, was shattering. The rot began at the heart of the empire itself. A devastating plague, a sickness brought back from the east by campaigning soldiers, swept through the Roman world, a firestorm of disease that left millions dead and decimated the imperial army. In Rome, it was said 2,000 people a day perished at its height. Against this backdrop of sickness and death, the political world began to fracture. The Roman emperor had long been a dictator, his power absolute. And wherever absolute power exists, there will always be ambitious men willing to risk everything to claim it. A series of civil wars erupted, tearing the empire apart as rival generals battled for the imperial throne. And it was in Britannia, the empire's farthest, bleakest, and most heavily fortified province, that the drums of these distant wars would beat the loudest. This created a fatal paradox, a structural flaw woven into the very fabric of Roman Britain that would time and again prove to be its undoing. The constant threats required the province to be garrisoned by an enormous army, as many as 40,000 soldiers at its peak, roughly 1/8 of the entire imperial military. This meant that any man put in command of Britannia's defence was by default one of the most powerful military figures in the entire Roman Empire. He held the key to a vast, battle-hardened force loyal to him personally. The temptation was irresistible. Any force strong enough to hold Britain was also strong enough to take Rome. And so we meet our first character in this repeating tragedy, a man named Clodius Albinus. He was born not in the heart of the empire, but on its African shores in modern-day Tunisia. He was a provincial, a man of humble birth who had risen through the ranks on sheer military skill. He was given the name Albinus, meaning white, because of the extraordinary, almost unnatural paleness of his complexion. A strange phenomenon his own father recorded with wonder at his birth. Appointed governor of Britannia, he was a tall, imposing figure, with a broad brow and a voice described as surprisingly high-pitched, almost as shrill as a eunuch's. For a time he governed well. He might have lived out his days as a respected official on the empire's fringe. But in the year 192 AD, the tyrannical Emperor Commodus was assassinated, leaving no heir. The empire plunged into the chaos known as the Year of the Five Emperors, and Albinus, with his legions shivering in the British rain, saw his chance. He would make what I call the British mistake. He would be the first, but he would be far from the last. From his windswept headquarters in Britannia, Clodius Albinus watched the empire tear itself apart. 5 men claimed the purple robes of the emperor, and one by one they were cut down in a whirlwind of betrayal and battle until only 2 credible contenders remained. One was Septimius Severus, a ruthless and brilliant general already sitting on the throne in Rome. The other was Albinus himself, the pale Tunisian, the favourite of the Roman Senate who still clung to the memory of the old republic. In a dramatic speech before his British legions, his shrill voice piercing the cold air, Albinus made a radical, electrifying promise. He would march on Rome not to become another dictator, but to restore the ancient democratic power of the caned Senate. It was a masterful piece of political theatre. His soldiers, men who had followed him into battle and trusted his command, roared their approval. They hailed him as their emperor, the only emperor they would serve. It was a declaration of rebellion, a direct challenge to the man in Rome. With his army's loyalty secured and messages of support arriving from the nervous senators, Albinus made his fateful decision. He knew he had to act decisively. He could not spare a single man. In the year 195 AD, he committed the first great act of self-destruction for the province he governed. He stripped Britannia of its defenders. Every last soldier, all 3 legions, the cavalry, the auxiliaries, he piled them all onto a fleet of ships and set sail for the mainland. Imagine the sight, the waters of the Channel thick with vessels, the sun glinting off the helmets of tens of thousands of legionaries, their bright red cloaks, a river of colour against the grey sea. It must have been an inspiring, intoxicating moment. A fleet sailing not just for power, but for an ideal, for the dream of a Rome that had been lost for centuries. But Albinus would not succeed. His dream of a restored republic would die in blood and mud. Though he was popular in Gaul and amassed a vast army of followers, he was finally cornered 2 years later by the forces of Septimius Severus at the Battle of Lugdunum, near modern-day Lyon in France. It was one of the largest and most ferocious battles in Roman history, a 2-day slaughter, involving as many as 300,000 soldiers. The fate of the empire hung in the balance. For a time it looked as if Albinus might win. His forces broke through Severus's lines, and the emperor himself was unhorsed, forced to tear off his imperial cloak and hide amongst his fleeing men. But the tide turned. Severus, a commander of iron, rallied his troops for a final desperate charge. Albinus's men began to break then, to flee a wave of panic sweeping through their ranks. Standing on a hill overlooking the carnage, Albinus realized all was lost. His grand ambition, his promise to his men, his dream of a restored republic, all of it had turned to ash. He drew his own dagger and ran himself through his pale skin stained crimson on the Gallic soil. Severus was not a man for magnanimity in victory. He rode his horse over Albinus's mangled corpse, a final brutal act of desecration. He had the head cut off, packed in straw, and sent to Rome to be paraded on a pike as a warning to the Senate. He then purged Albinus's family and followers with a ruthless efficiency. The dream of the Republic was dead forever. But while Albinus had lost his life, his doomed campaign had cost his province everything. For the 2 long years he had been at war, Britannia had been left utterly undefended. A land that depended on the constant presence of a Roman army for its economy and security descended into total anarchy. The Britons who had supplied the legions, the blacksmiths, the bakers, the leather workers, were suddenly without income. Their livelihoods vanished overnight. Into this power, vacuum chaos flooded. Local rebellions flared across the countryside. From the north, the Picts streamed over the unmanned wall. From the west, Scoti raiders ravaged the coasts. From the east, Saxon pirates plundered with impunity. The land that Albinus had abandoned was torn apart by the very forces his army had been there to contain. Rome would eventually return and retake control, but the damage was profound. Even a decade later, the new Roman governor wrote with palpable fear of the dire situation, describing a country where barbarians are in revolt, overrunning the country, carrying off treasure, and destroying most things. This was the British mistake, the fatal paradox laid bare. Britannia was a poisoned chalice. Its defense required an army so large, it was a constant temptation to its commander, a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the empire. And every time a general pulled the trigger, it was the people of Britain who paid the price in blood and fire. The province had become a staging ground for civil war, and its own stability was the first casualty. The clock was ticking for Roman Britain, and Albinus had just pushed the hands a long way toward midnight. History, it is said, does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. In the century that followed the doomed march of Albinus, the story of Roman Britain became a grim repeating stanza of rebellion and abandonment. Septimius Severus, after trampling his rival's corpse, sailed to Britain himself, determined to ensure such a challenge could never rise again. He led a huge punitive expedition into the mists of Caledonia, a brutal, ill-conceived adventure that achieved nothing but the loss of thousands of Roman lives to attrition and ambush. He returned with the border exactly where it had always been, and for good measure, split the province of Britannia in 2, hoping to dilute the power of any single governor. It was a bureaucratic fix for a problem that was fundamentally military and geographical. It would not last. The empire itself was entering a 50-year period of nightmarish instability known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. At least 26 claimants to the imperial throne rose and fell, most of them dying violently. Incessant civil wars and rampant hyperinflation crippled the economy, while barbarian tribes sensing weakness tore at the empire's frontiers. And through all this, Britain remained a fertile staging ground for rebellion, its vast garrison a prize for any ambitious commander. In 286 AD, a naval commander of humble birth named Carausius, tasked with clearing the channel of pirates, instead made a pact with them, using their combined might to declare himself Emperor of Britain. He carved the province, along with a slice of northern Gaul, away from the empire, and ruled his own breakaway state for 7 years, minting his own coins, and defying Rome with remarkable success before he was eventually assassinated by his own treacherous finance minister. Then, in 306 AD, the cycle seemed to offer a glimmer of hope. In the Roman city of Eboracum, modern York, a general named Constantine was crowned emperor by his troops. He marched on Rome, but unlike the others, he succeeded. After 20 years of brutal civil wars, he would reunite the entire Roman Empire under his sole rule, becoming Constantine the Great, the man who would famously embrace Christianity and change the course of Western history. It was a rare British success story, a brief moment when the province was not the source of a failed rebellion, but the launch pad for an emperor who would redefine the world. But it was an exception that proved the rule. For the most part, the 3rd century was a time of immense trauma for the empire, and the pressures on Britain only intensified. The enemies on its borders grew stronger, more organized. learning Rome's weaknesses, learning how to win. The island's economy, cut off from reliable trade, began to stagnate. And then, in the winter of 367 AD, an event occurred so shocking, so perfectly coordinated, it would shatter the illusion of Roman security forever. History remembers it as the Great Barbarian Conspiracy. Imagine the men stationed on Hadrian's Wall that winter. The wind howls relentlessly, driving a piercing sleet that seeps into their bones. Their letters home, found preserved in the waterlogged soil of the forts, are filled with complaints and the cold that bites at their feet, the lack of holidays, the watery, inadequate beer rations. They are a mix of Roman legionaries and auxiliary troops, many of them recruited from German tribes, men whose loyalty to the abstract idea of Rome was likely far weaker than their immediate misery. We will never know the exact reason. Perhaps it was bribery, a promise of gold from the Picts. Perhaps it was simply hunger, cold, and a profound sense of abandonment. Whatever the cause, the soldiers tasked with defending the northern frontier mutinied. They threw open the gates and allowed a waiting army of Picts to pour across the wall. This was not just a raid, it was an invasion. The horde swept south, burning towns and villages, putting men and women to the sword. But before Rome could react, before they could dispatch the usual reinforcements, something astonishing happened. As if on a signal, waves of raiders began to land on Britain's other coasts simultaneously. The fierce Atticotti from the Outer Isles, the Scoti from Ireland, and the Saxons from Germania all struck at once. At the same time, Franks and Saxons launched coordinated attacks on the coast of Gaul. This was not random opportunism, this was a plan. The scale and timing were unprecedented. A multi-pronged assault that completely overwhelmed the Roman defences. Amid the chaos, the two most senior Roman commanders in Britain were killed. Slaves escaped their bonds, and whole units of soldiers deserted in terror, forming roving gangs that plundered the countryside. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus paints a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos, a province collapsing into anarchy. For 2 whole years, northern Europe burned. Rome eventually sent its best general, Flavius Theodosius, to restore order, but the psychological damage was done. This was the empire's 9/11 moment. It was a coordinated, brutal strike that revealed a terrifying new level of sophistication among its enemies. Rome's confidence, already brittle, was broken. The shield had been pierced, and the fear that seeped through that crack would never truly go away. The Great Conspiracy had exposed just how fragile the Roman hold on Britain truly was, and how swiftly it could all fall apart. The Great Conspiracy had left a deep psychological scar on Britannia, but the final mortal wound would be self-inflicted. Once again, the island's fate would be decided not by the barbarians at the gates, but by the ambition of the man tasked with defending them. If Magnus Maximus had been a student of history, if he had ever read the cautionary tale of Clodius Albinus, the pale-skinned general who had marched on Rome 2 centuries before and lost everything, he might have chosen a different path. But history's greatest lesson is that its students always believe they are the exception. Maximus was a distinguished general from northern Spain, a man who had served with Theodosius in the brutal campaigns to restore order after the conspiracy. He was also a devout and zealous Christian, a follower of a faith that had in only a single lifetime gone from a persecuted cult to the dominant religion of the empire. Appointed governor of Britain in 380 AD, he immediately proved his military prowess by crushing a renewed invasion of Picts and Scots who had overrun the wall, celebrating his victory by building a huge new church on London's Tower Hill. But like so many governors before him, Maximus had ambitions that stretched far beyond the damp, windy confines of his provincial command. For years he had watched from afar as a deeply unpopular young emperor named Gratian sat on the imperial throne. Gratian was an eccentric. He loved to hunt and bizarrely surrounded himself exclusively with a band of Scythian archers, men from beyond the Danube who were to the Romans barbarians. The emperor was so enamored with their culture that he would often appear at court dressed in their traditional garb, a finely patterned overcoat and furs, a sight that deeply offended the Roman aristocracy. For a while this was tolerated as a strange quirk, but then in 378 AD Rome suffered a horrifying military catastrophe. At the Battle of Adrianople, a massive Roman army was not just defeated but annihilated by a force of Goths. The Eastern Emperor Valens was killed, his body never recovered. It was a cataclysmic blow that shook the empire to its core. Suddenly, the sight of Emperor Gratian dressing up like a barbarian didn't seem so harmless anymore. The people of Rome turned on him, and across the empire, rival claimants to the throne sensed their moment. Once again, the British paradox came into play. The hot-headed zealot Magnus Maximus, commanding his vast loyal army in Britain, decided the time was right. Just like Albinus before him, he resolved to march on Rome. And just like Albinus, he knew he couldn't spare a single man. In the year 383 AD, he repeated the fatal mistake. He gathered the entire Roman garrison of Britannia, the heart and soul of its defence, piled them onto a fleet of ships, and set sail for Gaul. The date, 383 AD, is a watershed moment. It is the last date ever found on a Roman coin in Wales. It is the last date for any archaeological trace of Roman presence in the northern Pennine Hills. For these places, Roman Britain ended the day Magnus Maximus sailed away. The 6th century British cleric Gilders, in his searing rant titled On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, put it bluntly. Britain is left deprived of all her soldiery and armed bands of her cruel governors, and of the flower of her youth, who went with Maximus, but never again returned. The departure of the garrison caused an immediate economic collapse, and Maximus, needing to fund his war, had also taxed the province brutally. With no soldiers and no money, the land he left behind exploded. Rebellions spread like wildfire. Raiders devastated the coasts. But Maximus, his eyes fixed on the ultimate prize, was blessed with astonishing initial success. Legions sent to stop him instead joined his cause. The disgraced Emperor Gratian was defeated outside Paris and killed soon after. Magnus Maximus, the governor from the Misty Isle, declared himself emperor, but this is where his luck ran out. Before he could consolidate his rule, his support began to crumble, partly because of the anarchy he had unleashed in his own heartland. Just as before, the province was descending into chaos, and just as before, it was the final straw. A coalition of rivals, including the son of the great Theodosius, marched against him. He was defeated, captured, and executed in 388 AD. He had held the title of emperor for 5 years, but he had sacrificed his province for it. The astonishing thing is he was not even the last. That final dishonor would fall to a common soldier, a man named Constantine, chosen by the desperate fragmenting army left in Britain, chosen, the historian Orosius sneers, simply from confidence inspired by his name and without any other qualifications to recommend him. We can assume this Constantine was not a reader of history either, because in the year 407 AD, sensing weakness in a Rome now being overrun by barbarian invasions, he did it again. He gathered what was left of Britain's legions and sailed for the continent. Most of his soldiers would never return. For Rome, enough was enough. The empire itself was now on the verge of collapse. An army of Goths was rampaging through Italy. The province of Britannia was a lost cause. In 410 AD, with the eternal city of Rome itself being sacked by invaders for the first time in 800 years, the Emperor Honorius sent a final terse message to the cities of Britain. He released them from their obligations to the empire. He told them to look to their own defences. It was not a declaration of independence. It was an act of abandonment. Rome withdrew its last officials and soldiers, stopped collecting taxes, and severed the umbilical cord that had bound the island to the continent for nearly 4 centuries. The great Roman experiment in Britain was over. They were on their own. Honorius's message arrived not as a declaration of freedom, but as a death sentence delivered from a world away. There were no victory parades in the streets of Londinium, no celebrations of independence. There was only a sudden, profound, and terrifying silence. The great grinding engine of the Roman state, which had shaped every aspect of life for 400 years, simply stopped. The steady flow of imperial coin, which paid the soldiers and administrators, vanished. The system of law, which for all its flaws provided a framework for society, dissolved. For the people of Britain, it was like the sun had gone out. They had not been freed, they had been orphaned, cast adrift on a dark and turbulent sea. The first to feel the change were the soldiers, the local auxiliaries, who had fought for Rome, but were not Roman enough to be evacuated. Their wages stopped, but their weapons remained. These men scattered in forts along the coasts, and the crumbling wall did not simply go home. They became the new power. They became warlords, carving out petty kingdoms from the carcass of the province, demanding tribute and supplies from the very people they had once been paid to protect. It was a protection racket on a national scale, the ghost of the Roman military now preying upon its own. To fight their endless internecine wars, these new kings needed more swords, and so they looked across the sea to the same Germanic tribes Rome had once paid to stay away. They hired Angles, Saxons and Jutes as mercenaries offering land in exchange for service. It was a desperate, short-sighted solution to deal with the wolf to guard the sheep. These fierce warriors came bringing their families, their language, their gods and their culture. They fought for their British paymasters, and then seeing a weak, fractured land ripe for the taking, they began fighting for themselves. The everyday language of Latin, once the tongue of commerce and government, faded into a whisper, surviving only in the chants of the Christian Church. The skill of writing, as far as we can tell, all but disappeared from secular life. For a time, history ceased to be recorded. People began to forget they had ever been Roman, their identities dissolving and reforming around the cultures of the powerful newcomers. And as the social fabric unraveled, the physical world of Roman Britain began to die. The cities, those proud symbols of imperial order, were the first to perish. Bit by bit, the great opulent villas that had once dominated the countryside were abandoned, their intricate mosaics cracking as roof beams heavy with rain fell in their private bathhouses, becoming stagnant ponds for frogs and waterweeds. The port of Londinium, once bustling with ships from across the known world, fell silent. Its suburbs, once neatly planned, turned to wasteland or were tilled for rough farming. The great church, built by Maximus, burned to the ground, and no one had the knowledge, the resources, or the will to rebuild it. The city's basilica, once the largest building north of the Alps, was dismantled, its fine-dressed stone quarried for humbler projects. People began to be buried inside the city walls, a profound taboo in Roman times, and their bones tell a story of rising violence 4 times more, bear the marks of sword and knife wounds than in the previous centuries. A small, ultra-wealthy elite may have clung on for a time, a terrified enclave of the old world, living in a kind of gated community, importing their wine and olive oil at great expense, denying the writing on the crumbling walls around them. But the decline was unstoppable. The city bled its people, who drifted back to a simpler, harsher existence in the countryside. By the end of the 5th century, Londinium was deserted. It was an uninhabited ruin, a city of ghosts sinking into the marsh and mud of the river. We can imagine ivy strangling its crumbling walls, young elder trees pushing their roots between the stones of the forum. The only people who dared to enter were scavengers, furtively picking through the debris for anything of value: iron nails to be recycled, lead pipes to be melted down, usable timber from the decaying buildings. One small, poignant artifact, the Billingsgate brooch, tells the story of these last human moments. A beautiful piece of jewellery, perhaps looted by a scavenger, and then dropped amidst the fallen roof tiles of a great house, lost forever in the rubble of a dead city. And it was not just London. In York, where the great Constantine had been crowned, the seasonal floods of the River Ouse reclaimed the land. Archaeologists have found the remains of water voles, shrews and frogs deep inside the old city, limits creatures of the swamp returning to their ancient home. The incoming Saxon peoples looked upon these vast, silent ruins with a mixture of awe and superstitious fear. They rarely built their new settlements near them, believing them to be haunted, cursed places. And it is here in this fear and incomprehension that a new mythology was born, to a people who now lived in wooden halls and no longer knew how to build in stone, who could no longer read the inscriptions carved on the arches. These monumental remains, these aqueducts, amphitheatres, and towering walls must have seemed impossible. They could not have been built by men. They must have been the work of a lost race of gods, or more likely of giants who had once walked England's rolling fields. And so we return to where we began, to that lone, unknown poet clambering through the bones of a shattered city centuries later. He looks upon the ruin, and he sees not just decay, but a lost golden age, a world of impossible grandeur, now fallen to the earth. He feels the wonder, the loss, and the haunting mystery of it all, and he gives it a voice that echoes down to us through the ages. He sees the collapsed roofs, the tumbled towers, the broken gates, and he sees the memory of what was. Bright were the city buildings he laments, many the bathhouses high, the gabled roofs, great the martial clamour, until mighty fate changed all that. He looks at the crumbling masonry, the silent halls where joyous gold-adorned warriors once feasted, and he feels the weight of all that has been lost. the ruin he walks is not just a place. It is the tombstone of a civilization, a final, poignant testament to a world that rose like a dream, and then just as surely crumbled unstoppably into the earth.